Now let's begin. Kenny Ogden pressed his palm against the rain-streaked window of his apartment, watching the city lights blur through the October downpour. The half-empty coffee mug on his desk had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't care. Work could wait. Thursday nights belonged to May. His phone chimed at exactly 7:30. Kenny smiled as his daughter's face filled the screen, her gap-toothed grin infectious even through the digital connection. "Daddy, look what Grandma made me." 8-year-old May held up a lumpy clay sculpture that might have been a horse or possibly a very confused dog. "That's amazing, sweetheart. Is that for your school project?" "Uh-huh. Mrs. Peterson said we could make anything we wanted about animals. Grandma's letting me use her kiln this weekend." Kenny's smile tightened fractionally. This weekend. The monthly custody arrangement that sent May to her maternal grandparents' house in Millbrook, 3 hours north. He'd fought against it during the divorce proceedings 2 years ago, but Christie's lawyer had painted him as the obsessive, controlling husband. The judge sided with family stability, which apparently meant May spending every third weekend with Daryl and Madeline Hudson. "Where's Grandma now?" Kenny asked, keeping his tone light. "Making dinner." "Grandpa's?" May's eyes shifted off-screen, her smile faltering. "He's in his study." Kenny felt the familiar knot form in his stomach. Daryl Hudson had always unsettled him, even back when Kenny and Christy were dating in college. The man was a retired high school principal, respected in his small town, always wearing a cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look grandfatherly and harmless. But Kenny had caught glimpses of something else in those watery blue eyes, a coldness that surfaced when he thought no one was watching. "You having fun otherwise, baby?" "Yeah. Tomorrow Grandma's taking me to the—" May stopped mid-sentence. Kenny heard a door open in the background. His daughter's expression changed, her face going carefully neutral. "Hi, Grandpa." "Hello there, little May." Daryl Hudson's voice drifted through the speaker, that particular false warmth Kenny had heard 1,000 times. "Still talking to your father?" "Just saying good night," May said quickly. "Too quickly. Your grandmother needs help in the kitchen. Run along now." It wasn't a suggestion. "Okay. Bye, Daddy. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart. I'll see you." The phone shifted. Kenny caught a glimpse of May's bedroom ceiling, heard her footsteps retreating. But the call didn't end. The phone must have fallen onto her bed, still transmitting audio. Kenny almost hung up. Then he heard May's voice again, distant now. "Grandpa, I was still talking to. I said your grandmother needs you." Daryl's voice had changed, stripped of its false gentleness. "Don't make me tell you twice." Kenny's hand tightened on his phone. He should hang up. This was an accident, an invasion of privacy. But something made him keep listening. Silence for several long seconds. Then May again, even more distant. I'm going. Not that way. Come here first." Daryl's voice was barely audible now. "I want to show you something in my study." "But Grandma said." "Your grandmother doesn't need to know everything, does she? We've talked about this, May. Our little secrets." Kenny's blood turned to ice. His daughter's voice, small and frightened. "I don't want to. Please, Grandpa. Daddy's waiting." "Your daddy isn't here. And if you tell him about our special time, May, well, you know what happens. You don't want your parents fighting again, do you? You don't want to be the reason they suffer." Kenny was already on his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed his car keys with his free hand, still listening. "Please." May's voice cracked. "I don't like it when—" "Hush now. Just for a little while. Be a good girl." Kenny ran for the door, phone pressed to his ear. The stairwell echoed with his pounding footsteps. He burst into the parking garage, fumbling with his key fob. Through the phone, he heard a door close. Then May's voice, clearer now, panicked. "No, Grandpa, please. I said I don't want to." "You're being dramatic, May. Just like your mother. Now hold still." "No." May screamed. "Stop it. Daddy. Daddy, help." Then the sound of impact, plastic hitting hardwood. The phone had fallen. Kenny heard scuffling, May's sobs, and then, "You little bitch." Daryl Hudson's voice, all pretense gone, replaced with rage. "After everything I've done for you. After I've been so patient. Get away from me." May shrieked. Kenny's tires squealed as he peeled out of the garage. He switched the call to his car's speakers, one hand on the wheel, the other grabbing his second phone to dial 911. "Grandma. Grandma, help." May's screams turned desperate. Then Madeline Hudson's voice, sharp and sudden. "Daryl, what is going on in?" She stopped. A pause that stretched too long. Oh my God. Daryl, what did you? Shut up, Madeline. This doesn't concern you. Your face. May, sweetheart, come here. Stay back. Daryl snapped. All of you just. A crash. Something heavy hitting the floor. Madeline screamed. May sobbed. Then a sound Kenny would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. A single, deafening crack that could only be a gunshot. Madeline's scream cut off abruptly. May's voice, thin with terror. Grandma? Grandma, look what you made me do, Daryl said, his voice hollow. Look what you made me do, May. This is your fault. Your father's fault. If you'd just been good. Monster. You're a monster. May sobbed. Another gunshot. Then silence. Terrible, complete silence. May. Kenny's voice cracked. May? Baby, answer me. Nothing. The line stayed open, but he heard only his own ragged breathing in the car's speakers. May? Please, baby, please answer me. May. The silence stretched on. Kenny called May's name over and over, his voice hoarse, while his other hand fumbled with his second phone. The 911 operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? My daughter. Kenny could barely speak. My daughter's in danger. There's been shooting. Shots fired. 2247, Oakwood Lane, Millbrook. Send everyone. Send everyone now. He gave them the details in broken fragments while his foot pressed the accelerator to the floor. The speedometer climbed past 90 as he flew down the empty highway, rain hammering his windshield. The 911 operator kept asking questions he couldn't answer. Was his daughter injured? He didn't know. Who fired the shots? Daryl Hudson. Was the shooter still armed? Probably. Was anyone else in the house? Not anymore. Kenny ended the call and tried May's phone again. It rang and rang and rang. No answer. He tried 46 more times over the next 2.5 hours, his mind conjuring increasingly horrific scenarios. His daughter's face, her gap-toothed smile, her small hand in his when they walked to the park. Her voice asking if he'd come to her school play. Her trust that he would always protect her. He'd failed. He'd heard her screaming for help, and he'd been 3 hours away. The rain intensified as he crossed into Millbrook County. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the winding country road that led to the Hudson house. No other cars. No sirens. Where were the police? He'd called them 2 hours ago. Kenny skidded to a stop in front of 2247, Oakwood Lane at 10:47 p.m. The house sat back from the road, a two-story colonial that looked deceptively peaceful in the storm. Lights blazed from every window. The front door hung open. No police cars. No ambulance. Nothing. Kenny killed his engine and ran through the rain, his shoes splashing through puddles. He was halfway to the porch when he saw her. May sat on the top step, alone in the downpour. Her pink pajamas were soaked through, plastered to her small frame. Her hair hung in wet tangles around her face. She stared straight ahead, unnaturally still, her arms wrapped around her knees. May. Kenny sprinted up the steps. Baby, are you? He stopped. Blood, washed by the rain but still visible, trailing down the porch steps from the open door. Diluted pink rivulets running through the grooves between the wooden boards. May slowly turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were wrong. Too wide, too empty. The eyes of someone who'd seen the end of the world. Daddy, she whispered. Please don't look inside. Kenny dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands hovering, afraid to touch her. Afraid she might shatter. Are you hurt? Did he hurt you? She didn't answer. Just stared at him with those hollow eyes. May, sweetheart, I need to know if you're hurt. I'm not hurt. Her voice was flat, mechanical. Not the way you mean. Kenny's hands were shaking. He made himself breathe, made himself focus. Okay, baby. I'm going to check inside, and then we're leaving. We're going right to the hospital. Don't look, Daddy. Please don't look. But he had to. He had to know. Kenny stood and walked through the open doorway into the Hudson house. The smell hit him first, copper and gunpowder and something else, something worse. The foyer was pristine, nothing out of place. Family photos lined the walls, smiling faces frozen in happier times. Christy's high school graduation. May's 3rd birthday party. Daryl and Madeline's 40th anniversary. Kenny followed the blood trail down the hallway. It led to Daryl Hudson's study. The door was ajar. Kenny pushed it open. Madeline Hudson lay on her back near the desk, her eyes open and unseeing, a hole in the center of her chest. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the Persian rug. Her hand was outstretched toward the door, as if she'd been reaching for the hallway. Reaching for May. Daryl Hudson sat in his leather desk chair, slumped forward over his antique desk. The right side of his head was missing. A revolver lay on the floor near his dangling hand. Blood and brain matter spattered the wall behind him, covering his framed teaching awards and family photographs. On the desk in front of him, barely visible beneath his left arm, was a composition notebook. Kenny stepped closer, his stomach roiling. The notebook was open, filled with Daryl's precise handwriting. The last entry was dated today. She threatened to tell. After all these years, she threatened to destroy everything. I gave her opportunities. I was patient. But children today, they don't understand gratitude. They don't understand sacrifice. It's May's fault. Christy's fault for raising her wrong. For leaving her with me. The irony. Christy was the perfect one. The obedient one. She learned. But this one, this May, she fights. She cries. She makes such a fuss. Madeline finally saw tonight. Finally walked in at the wrong moment. Saw what I had to do to teach May proper respect. The look on Madeline's face, betrayal, disgust. As if I was the monster. As if I hadn't built this family, this life, this perfect image. She was going to call the police. She made me do it. They all made me do it. Kenny's vision blurred. His hands clenched into fists so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. The notebook continued, but he couldn't read anymore. Couldn't process the words that made it clear this hadn't been the first time. That Christy, his ex-wife, May's mother, had been a victim too. The monster had documented everything. His justifications. His twisted logic. His complete lack of remorse. And then he'd taken the coward's way out. Kenny stumbled backward out of the study, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He made it to the hallway before he vomited, his body rejecting what his mind had witnessed. When he could stand again, he wiped his mouth and walked back to the porch. May hadn't moved. Still sat in the same position, rain streaming down her face. Kenny scooped her into his arms. She didn't resist, just let herself be lifted like a rag doll. He carried her down the steps toward his car, careful not to slip on the wet stairs. "Where are the police?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "They came," May said quietly against his shoulder. "2 officers. They talked to me. Asked what happened. I told them." Kenny stopped walking. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That grandpa was doing bad things to me. That grandma saw. That he shot her. That he shot himself." Her voice remained flat, emotionless. "They went inside. Then they came back out and made some calls. They said more people were coming. They said I should wait for my father. They just left you sitting in the rain? I told them to go. I wanted to wait alone." May finally looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. "I didn't want to be in that house anymore, Daddy. Not ever again." Kenny held her tighter, his throat closing up. "You never have to be. I promise, baby. Never again." He settled her into the passenger seat of his car, buckled her in, then grabbed the emergency blanket from his trunk and wrapped it around her. She didn't speak, just stared out the windshield at the house with its blazing windows and open door. As Kenny pulled away, he caught sight of flashing lights in his rearview mirror. More police finally arriving. An ambulance, a fire truck. Too late. Hours too late. But May was alive. That was all that mattered right now. As they drove through the storm back toward the city, back toward some semblance of safety, Kenny's mind was already working, already planning. Because as the shock began to recede, one thought crystallized with diamond-hard clarity. Daryl Hudson had gotten off easy. 1 bullet, instant death, no suffering, no justice. And if the notebook revealed what Kenny suspected, that this had gone on for months, maybe years, that his ex-wife Christy might have known, might have been a victim herself and stayed silent, then there were more people responsible. More people who'd let this happen. The law would handle the immediate aftermath, the investigation, the reports. But Kenny Ogden would handle everything else. He glanced at May, huddled in her blanket, trembling despite the car's heat. His daughter. His responsibility to protect. He'd failed once. He wouldn't fail again. The rain continued to fall as they drove through the night, leaving Millbrook and its horrors behind. But Kenny knew they couldn't really leave it behind. Not yet. Not until everyone who'd enabled Daryl Hudson's darkness had paid in full. 3 days later, Kenny sat in the sterile waiting room of Dr. Helen Yates' office while May attended her 3rd emergency therapy session. The child psychologist had been recommended by the hospital, a specialist in trauma and abuse. May had barely spoken since that night, moving through their apartment like a ghost. Kenny's phone buzzed. Christy. Again. She'd been calling nonstop since the news broke. He'd been sending her to voicemail, not ready to hear whatever justifications or excuses she might offer. But he needed answers. Eventually, he would need to confront her. Just not yet. Instead, he opened the email from Detective Marvin Richardson, the lead investigator on the case. Richardson had been professional but not particularly warm, treating the whole thing as an open-and-shut murder-suicide. Tragic, he'd called it. But at least the perpetrators saved the taxpayers some money. The email contained the preliminary forensics report. Kenny forced himself to read it, each word a knife in his gut. Madeline Hudson. Cause of death, gunshot wound to the chest. Time of death estimated at 7:52 p.m. Daryl Hudson. Cause of death, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Time of death estimated at 7:54 p.m. The notebook found on the scene had been entered into evidence. Richardson noted that it contained disturbing content suggesting long-term abuse of a minor, but didn't elaborate. The district attorney's office was reviewing it to determine if any other parties should be investigated. Kenny's jaw clenched. Disturbing content. That's what they called a pedophile's confession journal. The report continued with forensic details about the crime scene, bullet trajectories, blood spatter patterns, clinical descriptions of horror. Then, buried in the final paragraph, a note that made Kenny's blood run cold. Physical examination of the minor victim confirmed signs consistent with historical sexual abuse over an extended period. Child Protective Services has been notified. The minor's mother, Christy Hudson, has requested custody. Given the lack of evidence of her direct involvement and her status as the biological parent, this request will likely be granted pending a standard CPS review. Kenny read the paragraph 3 times, his fury building with each pass. Christy wanted custody. The same Christy whose father had abused their daughter for God knows how long. The same Christy who'd insisted on those monthly weekends in Millbrook, who'd dismissed Kenny's concerns as paranoia and overprotectiveness. His phone buzzed again. Christy. He answered this time. Kenny, finally. I've been trying to reach you for days. You want custody. His voice was ice. A pause. I'm her mother, Kenny. She needs her mother right now. She needs her mother? Kenny stood up, his voice rising. An older couple in the waiting room looked over, startled. He lowered his volume, but not his intensity. Where was her mother when your father was abusing her? Where were you, Christy? I didn't know. You think I would have let that happen if I knew? He was my father, Kenny. My father. How long? What? How long did you know? The truth, Christy. I've read his notebook. I know he did this before. I know you were, he couldn't say it. Couldn't voice the suspicion that had been growing since he'd read those entries. How long? The silence on the other end stretched too long. When Christy finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. It wasn't like with May. What he did to me was different. I was older, and he stopped when I got married. He promised he stopped. Kenny felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. You knew. You knew what he was capable of, and you sent May there anyway. No. I thought. I convinced myself it was different. That he'd changed. That he wouldn't. Her voice broke into sobs. I wanted to believe he loved her like a normal grandfather. I wanted my father to be the man I pretended he was. I was wrong. I was so fucking wrong, Kenny. You don't get her back. Kenny's voice was steady now, cold with certainty. I don't care what the law says. I don't care what CPS decides. You will never be alone with May again. You can't do that. I'm her mother. I have rights. You gave up those rights when you sacrificed our daughter to protect your illusion of a happy family. Kenny hung up. His hands were shaking. He wanted to throw the phone, wanted to scream, wanted to break something. Instead, he sat back down and forced himself to breathe. To think. Dr. Yates' door opened, and May emerged, her hand in the older woman's. The therapist's expression was carefully neutral, but Kenny caught the concern in her eyes. Mr. Ogden, could I speak with you for a moment? Kenny nodded. May sat down with a coloring book while he followed Dr. Yates into her office. I need to be direct with you, Dr. Yates said once the door closed. May's trauma is severe. The abuse was systematic and occurred over approximately 18 months. She has PTSD, possible dissociative episodes, and a profound trust violation that will take years to process. Kenny nodded, his throat tight. I'm also concerned about what she told me today regarding her mother. Dr. Yates pulled out her notes. May said that 6 months ago, she tried to tell her mother something was wrong, that she didn't want to go to Grandpa's house anymore. According to May, her mother told her to stop being dramatic and that Grandpa was just affectionate. Does that align with what you know? I suspected Christy knew something. Now I'm certain. Kenny met the therapist's eyes. She called me today. She wants custody. Dr. Yates' expression hardened. Over my dead body. I'll be submitting my professional recommendation to CPS and the court. May needs stability, safety, and a parent she can trust. Right now, Mr. Ogden, you're the only one who fits that description. Thank you. Kenny stood. Is there anything else I should know? Yes. Dr. Yates hesitated. May mentioned something today that concerns me. She said she wants her grandfather to hurt forever. That dying was too easy for him. She's 8 years old, and she's thinking about revenge. She fixed Kenny with a penetrating stare. I need to know that you're going to help her process these feelings in a healthy way. That you're not going to validate them or, God forbid, model that behavior. Kenny held her gaze. I want what's best for May. Whatever that takes. It wasn't a lie. He did want what was best for May. And what was best for May was ensuring that everyone who'd enabled her abuse faced consequences. Real consequences. Not the kind that came from courts and lawyers and official reports. The kind that came from a father who would do anything to protect his daughter. That night, after May finally fell asleep in her bed, Kenny sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and the copies of documentation he'd obtained from Detective Richardson. The detective had been surprisingly forthcoming, perhaps because he was a father himself. Perhaps because he understood Kenny's need for answers. The notebook, the forensics reports, May's statement to police, the CPS preliminary assessment, and, most damningly, emails between Daryl Hudson and several of his former colleagues from the high school where he'd been principal. Kenny read through them systematically, building a picture that grew darker with each passing hour. Daryl hadn't been working alone. Not completely. The emails referenced a network of individuals, coded language about shared interests, and private gatherings. Names appeared repeatedly. Gregory Watkins, Daryl's former vice principal. Lowell Atkinson, the school district superintendent. Ronald Davenport, a child psychologist who'd assessed May 2 years ago after Christie's divorce attorney had ordered an evaluation. Kenny had met Davenport. The man had declared May perfectly happy and well-adjusted. Had seen nothing to indicate abuse or trauma. Had submitted a report supporting Christie's custody arrangement that included monthly visits to Millbrook. Now Kenny understood why. Davenport had been protecting Daryl. Protecting the network. His phone rang. An unknown number. Kenny answered. Mr. Ogden? This is Bradley Klein. I'm an attorney representing certain interests related to your former father-in-law's estate. Kenny's instincts flared. What do you want? I understand this is a difficult time. I want you to know that my clients are deeply sympathetic to your daughter's situation. We'd like to offer a settlement, generous compensation in exchange for your agreement not to pursue civil litigation or make public statements about Mr. Hudson's private matters. Private matters. Kenny's voice was flat. You mean his documented history of child abuse? A pause. The documentation you're referring to is subject to legal privilege and ongoing investigation. Making unfounded accusations could be considered defamation. Who are your clients, Mr. Klein? I'm not at liberty to say, but they're prepared to offer $2 million, placed in a trust for your daughter's future. All you need to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement and agree not to cooperate with any journalists or authors who might seek to sensationalize this tragedy. Kenny understood. The network was circling the wagons. They wanted to buy his silence before he could expose them. I need to think about it, Kenny said. Of course. I'll email you the preliminary documents. But Mr. Ogden? Time is of the essence. The offer expires in 72 hours. The call ended. Kenny sat in the darkness, his mind racing. $2 million. Money that could pay for May's therapy, her college, her future. Money that could buy them a new life far away from Millbrook and its horrors. All he had to do was stay silent. Let the dead keep their secrets. Let the living escape justice. Kenny looked down at his hands. Hands that had held his daughter as she trembled. Hands that had carried her out of that house. Hands that could do something with the information he'd gathered. Or hands that could sign a piece of paper and take the money. He thought of May, lying in her bed, plagued by nightmares. Thought of the hollow look in her eyes. Thought of all the other children who might encounter Gregory Watkins, Lowell Atkinson, Ronald Davenport, and whoever else was part of Daryl Hudson's network. Kenny opened his laptop and began typing a response to Bradley Klein. I'll consider your offer. But first, I need some questions answered. Who else knew? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, who else in your network is still actively abusing children? He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Then he opened a new browser window and started searching for something else. Private investigators. Security experts. People who specialized in finding information that others wanted to keep hidden. Because whatever happened next, Kenny needed leverage. He needed to know exactly who he was dealing with and what they were capable of. And then he needed to decide, take the money and run, or burn it all down and damn the consequences. Kenny looked at May's closed bedroom door, thinking of his little girl who said dying was too easy for the monster who'd hurt her. Maybe she was right. Maybe some people deserved to hurt before they fell. The next morning, Kenny dropped May at Dr. Yates' office for her daily session and drove across the city to meet Calvin Humphrey, a private investigator whose name had come up repeatedly in his late-night research. Humphrey operated out of a nondescript office above a hardware store, the kind of place designed not to be remembered. Mr. Ogden. Humphrey was in his 50s, weathered and competent-looking, with the careful eyes of someone who'd seen too much. I read about what happened. I'm sorry. I need information, Kenny said without preamble. He slid a USB drive across the desk. Everything in there is either public record or given to me by the police. I need you to dig deeper. Find out who these men are, what they've been doing, and how they've gotten away with it. Humphrey plugged in the drive and spent several minutes reviewing the contents, his expression growing darker. Finally, he looked up. This is a fucking nightmare. You know that, right? These aren't small-time perverts. We're talking about a former school superintendent, a licensed psychologist, a prominent attorney. People with resources and connections. I know. What exactly are you planning to do with this information? Kenny met his eyes. Make sure they can't hurt anyone else. Humphrey studied him for a long moment. I've got 2 daughters myself, 10 and 13. I read what happened to yours, and I barely slept. So I'm going to be straight with you. I'll find everything you want to know. But what you do with it, that's on you. I don't know, I don't want to know, and I can't be subpoenaed about things I don't know. We clear. Crystal. My rate is $200 an hour plus expenses. This kind of investigation could take weeks. Could cost $30,000, $40,000. Maybe more if I have to pay for certain specialized services. Kenny thought of the $2 million Bradley Klein had offered. Blood money. But money that could be put to better use than lining the pockets of enablers and abusers. Do it. Whatever it costs. I need names, addresses, patterns, evidence. Everything. You'll have it. Humphrey stood and extended his hand. Kenny shook it. One more thing, Mr. Ogden. When this is done, I never met you. This conversation never happened. Understood. Kenny spent the next 2 weeks in a strange limbo. Days were consumed with May, therapy appointments, school meetings to arrange her extended absence, consultations with family court attorneys about Christie's custody challenge. Nights were spent reviewing Calvin Humphrey's reports as they trickled in, each one more damning than the last. Gregory Watkins, the former vice principal, had been quietly dismissed from 2 previous schools for inappropriate conduct with students. Both times, settlements had been reached and NDAs signed. He now worked as an educational consultant, giving him access to children across multiple districts. Lowell Atkinson, the superintendent, had used his position to cover up several allegations against teachers and administrators over the past 15 years. He'd also taken multiple consulting trips to Southeast Asia, destinations known for sex tourism. Immigration records showed Daryl Hudson had accompanied him on 3 of those trips. Ronald Davenport, the psychologist, specialized in custody evaluations. Humphrey had found 6 cases where Davenport had assessed children later proven to have been abused, and in each case, he'd found nothing wrong. He'd also been Daryl Hudson's patient, receiving therapy for anxiety and depression. The therapeutic relationship had been undisclosed in May's evaluation, a massive ethical violation that alone could destroy Davenport's career. Bradley Klein, the attorney, wasn't just representing the network, he was part of it. Humphrey had uncovered sealed juvenile records from 30 years ago when Klein had been charged with soliciting a minor. The charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence after the victim recanted. The victim had later died by suicide at age 19. And there were others. More names. More connections. A web of predators and enablers who'd protected each other for decades. Christie appeared in the network's orbit, too, though not as a perpetrator. Humphrey's report included old therapy records that Daryl had kept, his own daughter's records from when she was a teenager, documenting her abuse and his treatment plan to keep her compliant and silent. Reading them made Kenny physically ill. His ex-wife hadn't just been a complicit parent. She'd been a victim so thoroughly broken that she'd learned to perpetuate the cycle, offering up her own daughter rather than face the truth about her family. Kenny didn't know whether that made him hate her more or less. On the 14th day after the incident, Bradley Klein called again. "Mr. Ogden, you've been avoiding my calls. The deadline for our offer has passed. My clients are prepared to withdraw. Tell your clients I want $5 million, Kenny interrupted. Not 2. 5. And I want individual names. Everyone who's contributing to the settlement. Everyone who wants my silence. That's not how this works. That's exactly how it works now. You wanted to buy my silence? Fine. But I'm not selling cheap. $5 million, full disclosure of who's paying, and a detailed accounting of why they're so desperate to keep this quiet. You have 48 hours. After that, I take everything I know to the FBI and every news outlet in the country." He hung up before Klein could respond. 2 hours later, Calvin Humphrey called. "Whatever you just did, you rattled some cages. I've got people following me. Professional surveillance, not amateurs. Can you handle it?" "Yeah, but it's going to cost you. I need to bring in some specialists, make sure my security's airtight. Another 10 grand, minimum. Do it. And Calvin, be careful." "Always am." Kenny stood at his apartment window, watching the street below. A dark sedan sat parked across the street, slightly too obvious to be a real threat. A message, "We're watching you." Good. Let them watch. Let them worry. Because Kenny was done playing defense. Done reacting. Done letting these people control the narrative. It was time to go on offense. That night, after May was asleep, Kenny composed an email. Not to Bradley Klein or the network. To someone else entirely. Vince Shepard ran a true crime podcast that had recently exposed a ring of corrupt police officers in a neighboring state. He was aggressive, unafraid of powerful interests, and had a track record of bringing down people who thought they were untouchable. Kenny attached everything. The full investigative file from Calvin Humphrey. Copies of Daryl's notebook. The forensic reports. The emails. The travel records. The pattern of covered-up allegations. Everything that painted a complete picture of the network. Subject line. The Millbrook Network. How a retired principal built a child abuse ring under everyone's noses. His finger hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. Send this email, and Bradley Klein's settlement offer would evaporate. The network would lawyer up, go into damage control. They'd come after Kenny with everything they had. Lawsuits, intimidation, maybe worse. But May would be safe. Because once this story broke, once the spotlight turned on these men, they'd be too busy trying to save themselves to hurt anyone else. Kenny thought about the $2 million. The $5 million. Money that could change May's life. Then he thought about all the other children. The ones Daryl Hudson had hurt before May. The ones Gregory Watkins was still positioned to abuse. The ones who would be evaluated by Ronald Davenport and sent into dangerous situations. His daughter had said dying was too easy for her grandfather. But Kenny wasn't interested in easy. He was interested in justice. He clicked send. The story broke 72 hours later. Vince Shepard's podcast released a 3-part special series titled The Millbrook Network, and within 6 hours, every major news outlet had picked it up. The allegations were too specific, too well documented to ignore. Gregory Watkins was arrested within 24 hours on charges of possession of child pornography, evidence Shepard's team had turned over to authorities. His computers contained thousands of images and videos, some featuring children from his own schools. Lowell Atkinson resigned from his position as superintendent amid calls for a federal investigation into the school district's handling of abuse allegations. His passport was flagged, and he was placed on the no-fly list while investigators examined his travel history. Ronald Davenport lost his license to practice psychology. Multiple former patients came forward with complaints about his unethical conduct and biased evaluations. Criminal charges were pending. Bradley Klein was placed on administrative leave from his law firm while the state bar investigated his involvement. The sealed juvenile records from his past were mysteriously leaked to the press. His career was effectively over, and the story kept growing. More victims came forward. More names were added to the investigation. What had started as one retired principal's crimes became a sprawling expose of systemic failure, corruption, and deliberate cover-ups spanning 3 decades. Kenny watched it all unfold from his apartment, holding May's hand as they sat on the couch. She didn't fully understand the news reports, didn't grasp the magnitude of what was happening, but she understood that people were finally listening, finally believing, finally acting. "Daddy," May said quietly during a commercial break. "Are the bad men going to jail?" "Yes, baby. All of them." "Good." She leaned against his shoulder. "Grandpa should have gone to jail too. Not just stopped." "I know. You made this happen," May said, looking up at him. "Dr. Yates said I'm not supposed to think about revenge. But you did it anyway, didn't you?" Kenny hesitated, weighing his response. Finally, he decided on honesty. "This wasn't revenge, sweetheart. Revenge is about hurting people because you're hurt. This was about justice. About making sure no one else gets hurt the way you were hurt." May considered this. What's the difference? Revenge makes you feel better for a little while, but then it just makes you emptier. Justice makes the world safer. Safer is better. Oh, May was quiet for a moment. Did it make you feel better? Kenny thought about it. About the satisfaction he'd felt when the arrest started. About the grim determination that had carried him through the investigation. About the nights he'd spent consumed with rage and the need to make someone, anyone, pay for what had happened to his daughter. A little, he admitted. But what really makes me feel better is knowing you're safe. And that you're going to heal. That's what matters most. May nodded and turned back to the TV. Kenny kissed the top of her head, marveling at her resilience. She had nightmares still, jumped at loud noises, clung to him in crowded places. But she was here. She was alive. She was talking about it, processing it with Dr. Yates, slowly beginning to rebuild trust in the world. It would take years, maybe a lifetime. But they had time now. His phone buzzed. Christy. Again. She'd been calling constantly since the story broke, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to accusatory to desperate. Kenny had listened to exactly one of them. The one where she'd sobbed about how she'd tried to protect May the only way she knew how, by pretending nothing was wrong. It hadn't made him hate her less, but it had helped him understand her. He sent the call to voicemail. Not today. Maybe not ever. Some damage couldn't be repaired, only endured. Another call came in immediately after. Calvin Humphrey. You watching the news? Humphrey asked. All day. You did it. You actually fucking did it. Do you know how many people tried to expose these guys over the years? How many parents, teachers, social workers? They all got shut down, paid off, or intimidated into silence. But you actually brought them down. We brought them down, Kenny corrected. I couldn't have done it without your investigation. Yeah, well, my invoice is in the mail. $37,000. Worth every penny if you ask me. Kenny laughed, a sound he hadn't made in weeks. I'll pay it gladly. One more thing, Humphrey said, his tone shifting. You've got protection, right? These guys still have friends. People who might decide you're a threat that needs to be eliminated. I've thought about that. Think harder. I'm serious, Ogden. Get a security system. Vary your routines. Maybe consider relocating for a while. I'm not running from them. It's not running. It's being smart. You've got a daughter to protect, remember? Kenny glanced at May, still absorbed in the TV. You're right. I'll take precautions. After the call ended, Kenny did exactly that. He hired a security consultant to assess his apartment and install a comprehensive alarm system. He changed his phone number and May's. He enrolled May in a new school under a slightly modified name. May Hudson Ogden became May Ogden, dropping her mother's surname entirely. The family court case resolved itself without a trial. Christy withdrew her custody petition after her own attorney advised her that fighting it would only result in public testimony about her knowledge of the abuse. CPS recommended full custody to Kenny with supervised visitation for Christy, 2 hours per month at a neutral location with a social worker present. Christy attended the first visitation. May refused to see her. The second visitation, May agreed to come but wouldn't speak to her mother beyond monosyllables. By the third visitation, Christy stopped showing up. She left a voicemail for Kenny explaining that she was entering a residential treatment program to deal with her own trauma. She would respect May's needs and give her space. Maybe someday, they could have a relationship. But not now. Kenny saved the voicemail, just in case May wanted to hear it someday. Just in case his daughter ever needed proof that her mother had, in her own broken way, tried to do the right thing in the end. Months passed. The investigation continued to expand. Federal prosecutors built cases against 12 individuals tied to the network. 3 had already taken plea deals in exchange for testimony against the others. Gregory Watkins' trial was set for the following spring. He was facing 43 counts of child exploitation. His attorney tried to argue that Watkins was a victim of Daryl Hudson's manipulation, that he'd been groomed himself. The argument fell flat when prosecutors revealed that Watkins had abused children before ever meeting Daryl. Lowell Atkinson fled the country 2 days before he was scheduled to be indicted. He'd made it as far as Costa Rica before being arrested at the border, trying to enter Nicaragua. Extradition proceedings were underway. Ronald Davenport was out on bail, living in his brother's basement, monitored by an ankle bracelet. His trial was scheduled after Watkins. He'd aged 20 years in the 6 months since the story broke, his hair gone white, his face gaunt. Kenny had seen him once, by accident, in the grocery store. Davenport had recognized Kenny immediately, his eyes widening with terror before he'd abandoned his cart and fled. Good. Let him be afraid. Let him feel a fraction of the fear May had felt. Bradley Klein had been disbarred and was facing criminal charges for obstruction of justice. He'd attempted suicide 3 months after the scandal broke, but had survived. He was currently in psychiatric care, awaiting trial. Kenny took no pleasure in these outcomes. No satisfaction in the destruction of these men's lives. But he felt a deep, abiding sense of rightness, of justice served. May's 8th birthday arrived in late November. She wanted a small party, just Kenny, Dr. Yates, and 2 girls from her new school she'd cautiously befriended. No family, no mother, no grandparents, just the people she trusted. They celebrated in the apartment with cake and board games. May smiled, genuinely smiled, when she blew out her candles. Her wish, she told Kenny later, was for the nightmares to stop. They hadn't yet, but they were coming less frequently. And May was learning to fight them, to remind herself that she was safe, that the monster was gone and couldn't hurt her anymore. After the party, after May's friends went home and Dr. Yates said goodnight with a warm hug and a reminder to call if they needed anything, Kenny tucked his daughter into bed. "Daddy," May said as he turned out the light. "Thank you." "For what, baby?" "For believing me. For saving me. For making the bad men stop." Kenny's throat tightened. "You don't have to thank me for that. That's my job. That's what fathers do." "Not all fathers." May's voice was very small in the darkness. "Some fathers are the bad men. I know, but I'm not that kind of father. I'm never going to be that kind of father. I know." May was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think I'll ever be normal again?" The question gutted him. Kenny sat back down on the edge of her bed, finding her hand in the dark. "Sweetheart, you're already normal. What happened to you wasn't normal. But you? You're brave and smart and strong. And yes, you've been hurt. But hurt people can heal. Dr. Yates says so. And I believe her. I believe in you." "Okay." May squeezed his hand. "I believe you." Kenny sat with her until she fell asleep, then sat a little longer, watching her breathe. Watching the miracle of his daughter, alive and healing and slowly becoming whole again. He thought about revenge. About justice. About the difference May had asked him to explain. Revenge would have been finding those men and making them suffer personally. Revenge would have been violence and rage and temporary catharsis that solved nothing. Justice was this. Was watching them destroyed by their own crimes. Was knowing they would spend years or decades in prison, their reputations shattered, their careers ended, their names synonymous with evil. Justice was May getting to grow up, getting to heal, getting to have birthday parties and friendships, and a father who would never fail her again. Kenny stood up slowly, careful not to wake her. He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Gregory Watkins sat in a cell awaiting trial. Lowell Atkinson languished in a Costa Rican jail. Ronald Davenport counted the days until his own trial, knowing his life as he'd known it was over. Bradley Klein recovered from his suicide attempt, facing the reality of his choices and their consequences. And Daryl Hudson was dead, his reputation destroyed posthumously, his name a curse word in the community he'd once dominated. They'd all paid a price. Not enough, maybe. Prison was too clean, too safe, too civilized for what they'd done. But it was something. It was justice. And sometimes, Kenny reflected, justice had to be enough. Because the alternative, the consuming rage, the obsessive need for personal vengeance, the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole if he let it, that wouldn't help May heal. Wouldn't make him a better father. Wouldn't honor the promise he'd made to himself the night he'd carried her out of that house. His phone buzzed. A message from Vince Shepard. Just got word. 2 more arrests today. Both teachers at Hudson's old school. Your story is still breaking cases. You should be proud. Kenny typed back. Not my story. May's. And all the other victims. I just made sure people listened. You did more than that. You gave those victims justice. That's no small thing. Kenny didn't respond. He pocketed his phone and stood at the window a while longer, thinking about fathers and daughters, monsters and heroes, revenge and justice. And he thought about a little girl who'd sat in the rain covered in blood, telling her father not to look inside. A little girl who'd survived the worst humanity had to offer and was slowly, painfully, learning to trust the world again. She was the real hero of this story. Kenny was just the father who refused to let her down twice. He turned away from the window and walked down the hall to his own bedroom. Tomorrow he'd take May to therapy. Tomorrow he'd review more documents from the prosecution. Tomorrow he'd continue the work of being present, being patient, being the father his daughter needed. But tonight, he would sleep. And if the nightmares came, because they came for him too, replays of that phone call, of what he'd found in that house, he would remind himself of the same thing he told May. The monsters were gone. They couldn't hurt anyone anymore. And that, in the end, was victory enough. 3 years later, Kenny stood in the back of a packed courtroom, watching the final piece of the puzzle fall into place. Gregory Watkins, the last of the network to go to trial, sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his head bowed as the jury foreman read the verdict. On count 1, possession of child sexual abuse material, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, distribution of child sexual abuse material, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman continued through 41 more counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each verdict was a nail in Watkins' coffin. And with each one, Kenny felt a small piece of the weight he'd carried for 3 years lift from his shoulders. When it was over, when Watkins had been led away in chains to await sentencing, Kenny walked out of the courthouse into brilliant spring sunshine. He pulled out his phone and called May. Daddy? How did it go? Guilty on all counts, Kenny said. He'll never hurt anyone again. Good. May's voice was stronger now, fuller. The voice of an 11-year-old who'd fought her way back from hell and emerged scarred but unbroken. Dr. Yates says that's supposed to bring me closure. Does it? I don't know. Maybe. May paused. I think closure is kind of overrated. I'm not ever going to forget what happened. But I don't think about it every day anymore. Is that the same thing? Kenny smiled. Yeah, baby. I think that's exactly the same thing. Cool. Hey, Daddy, can Emma sleep over tonight? We're working on a project for science class, and, of course, I'll pick up pizza for dinner. Thanks. Love you, Daddy. Love you too, sweetheart. Kenny ended the call and stood there for a moment, marveling at the normalcy of that conversation. A girl asking about sleepovers and science projects. A father agreeing to pizza. The mundane, beautiful reality of a life that had been shattered and slowly, painstakingly pieced back together. The last 3 years hadn't been easy. May had good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. There had been panic attacks at school, night terrors that left her screaming for hours, therapy sessions where she couldn't stop crying or couldn't speak at all. But there had also been breakthroughs. The first time May had laughed at a stupid joke. The first sleepover she'd agreed to attend. The first time she'd called Kenny from school just to chat, not because she was having a crisis. The slow accumulation of normal moments that meant healing was happening, even if it was happening in fits and starts. Kenny had been there for all of it. Every therapy session, every school event, every 2 a.m. nightmare. He'd rearranged his entire life around May's needs, taking a demotion at work to accommodate the flexible schedule her healing required. He'd learned to recognize her triggers, to give her space when she needed it and presence when she needed that instead. And he'd learned to let go of the rage that had consumed him in those first months, of the obsessive need to personally punish every person who'd ever enabled Daryl Hudson's crimes, of the fantasy of revenge that had sometimes felt more appealing than the difficult, unglamorous work of actually being present for his daughter. Justice had been served. Not perfectly, maybe. Not completely. But enough. Watkins would die in prison. His sentence would be consecutive terms totaling over 300 years. Lowell Atkinson had received 47 years after fighting extradition for 18 months. Ronald Davenport was serving 25 years, having taken a plea deal to avoid trial. And the others, the dozen men whose names had emerged from the expanding investigation, they'd all faced consequences too. Some were in prison. Some had lost their careers. Some had fled the country and lived as fugitives. The network had been destroyed, not by Kinney's personal vengeance, but by the exposure of truth. By the courage of multiple victims who'd come forward after May's story broke. By prosecutors who'd built meticulous cases. By a justice system that, for once, had actually worked. Kinney walked to his car, thinking about that night 3 years ago when he'd composed the email to Vince Shepard. When he'd chosen justice over revenge, exposure over violence, truth over silence. It had cost him. The settlement money had evaporated. Bradley Klein's offer had been withdrawn the moment the story went public. Kinney had spent tens of thousands on legal fees, security, relocation costs. He'd been sued by 2 of the men he'd exposed, frivolous lawsuits that had ultimately been dismissed, but had still required expensive legal defense. But he'd do it all again, without hesitation. Because May was alive. May was healing. May had friends and interests and a future that wasn't defined solely by what had been done to her. That was the only victory that mattered. Kinney drove home through the city, spring flowers blooming in the parks he passed, thinking about fathers and daughters and the kinds of men who deserved the title. Thinking about the difference between justice and revenge, between punishment and healing. When he got home, May was in her room with Emma, the 2 of them bent over a poster board covered in diagrams of the solar system. They looked up when Kinney knocked on the open door. "Pizza should be here in 30 minutes, he said. "Perfect. Thanks, Mr. Ogden." Emma was a cheerful girl with bright red hair and more freckles than face. She'd been the first kid at May's new school to reach out, to see past the quiet new girl who flinched at loud noises. They'd been inseparable since. "You need anything else?" "Nope, we're good." May smiled at him. That gap-toothed smile he'd been terrified he'd never see again. "Oh, Daddy, I forgot to tell you. I got my essay back from Mrs. Peterson. I got an A+. That's wonderful. What was the essay about?" May's smile flickered slightly. "Heroes. Real ones, not like superheroes. I wrote about you." Kinney's throat tightened. "May, I'm not." "Yes, you are." May's voice was firm. "Mrs. Peterson said it was the best essay in the class. She said I should consider entering it in the district writing contest." "What did you say about me?" "That you're the kind of hero who doesn't wear a cape or have superpowers. You're the kind who shows up every day and does the hard work of keeping people safe. The kind who believes victims even when it's complicated. The kind who makes sure bad guys face consequences even when it's easier to stay quiet." May paused. "I also wrote about how you taught me that healing is harder than revenge, but more important." Kinney had to look away, blinking back tears. "You're the brave one, sweetheart. All you did was everything." May crossed the room and hugged him. "I know I don't say it enough, but thank you. For everything. For believing me. For fighting for me. For being here." Kinney held his daughter, marveling at her strength. At her capacity to trust again after every reason to never trust anyone. At her resilience and wisdom that seemed impossibly mature for 11 years old. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. "More than okay. You're going to be extraordinary." "I know," May said simply. "Because I have you." Emma cleared her throat awkwardly. "This is super sweet and all, but can we maybe finish the poster before the pizza comes? I'm starving." May pulled away, laughing. Emma's always hungry. It's kind of her superpower. "Hey, rude." The girls went back to their project, arguing cheerfully about whether Pluto should be included as a planet. Kinney watched them for a moment, storing this memory alongside all the others he'd collected over the past 3 years. The ordinary moments. The proof that May was more than her trauma. That she had a life beyond what had been done to her. His phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Yates. "Heard about the Watkins verdict. How are you both doing?" Kinney typed back. "We're good. May's having a friend over. Working on a school project. Everything's normal. Normal is an underrated miracle. You should both be proud. We are." Kinney pocketed his phone and went to the kitchen to wait for the pizza. As he stood there, looking at the ordinary clutter of his ordinary life. May's school papers on the fridge, her backpack by the door, her shoes kicked off in the hallway. He thought about the path he'd chosen 3 years ago. He could have taken the settlement money, could have stayed silent, could have moved May somewhere far away and tried to forget the whole thing ever happened. Or he could have gone the other way, could have hunted down those men personally, could have made them suffer in ways the justice system never would, could have prioritized revenge over his daughter's needs. He'd chosen neither. He'd chosen the harder path, the one that required patience and faith in a system that so often failed, the one that prioritized May's healing over his own need for satisfaction, the one that traded personal vengeance for systemic justice. And it had worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The doorbell rang. Kenny paid for the pizza and called the girls out for dinner. They ate at the coffee table in the living room, May and Emma chattering about their teachers and classmates, about the new Marvel movie they wanted to see, about whether TikTok was still cool or if it was time to move on to whatever the next app would be. Normal conversation, normal concerns, normal life. After Emma's parents picked her up, after May went to bed, Kenny sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and pulled up his email. A message from Vince Shepard sat at the top of his inbox. Kenny, thought you'd want to know. The documentary about the Millbrook Network just won an Emmy. And more importantly, 3 more victims came forward this week, cases in different states. Your decision to go public 3 years ago is still creating ripples, still bringing justice. Thank you for trusting me with the story. Kenny read the message twice, then closed his laptop. He wasn't interested in accolades or awards. Wasn't interested in being celebrated as some kind of hero. He was just a father who'd done what any father should do, protected his child, and fought to make sure the people who'd hurt her couldn't hurt anyone else. That was all. That was everything. He stood up and walked down the hall to May's room, opening her door just enough to see her sleeping peacefully, her face relaxed, no nightmares tonight. Her clay sculpture, the lumpy horse-dog hybrid, sat on her nightstand, a reminder of that terrible phone call 3 years ago. But it was also a reminder that she'd survived, that she'd kept creating and learning and growing despite everything that had tried to break her. Kenny quietly closed the door and walked to his own room. Tomorrow he'd take May to her soccer game. Tomorrow he'd help her practice her presentation for the writing contest. Tomorrow he'd continue the work of being present, being patient, being the father she deserved. But tonight he would rest. And he would remember the choice he'd made 3 years ago, to seek justice instead of revenge, truth instead of silence, healing instead of hatred. It had been the right choice. Not the easiest one, not the most satisfying in the moment, but the right one. Because May was safe. May was healing. May had a future. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. The revenge he'd taken wasn't violence or personal vendetta. It was something more powerful: exposure, truth, justice. He'd torn down a network of predators not with his fists but with evidence and persistence and the courage to make their crimes public. He'd ensured they would spend years or decades paying for what they'd done, that their names would be synonymous with evil, that they would never hurt another child. And he'd done it without becoming a monster himself, without scarring May further by modeling revenge and violence, without sacrificing his humanity to satisfy his rage. Some people might think that was weakness. That real justice required blood and pain and personal vengeance. But Kenny knew better. The men who'd hurt his daughter were destroyed, careers ended, reputations shattered, freedom taken, names cursed. They would spend the rest of their lives paying for their crimes. And May was free. Free to heal. Free to grow. Free to be more than what had been done to her. That was victory. That was strength. That was the revenge of a father who loved his daughter more than he hated her abusers. And as Kenny turned out the lights and finally, after 3 years of nightmares and hypervigilance and constant worry, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay, he understood that this was what heroism looked like. Not dramatic confrontations or violent justice. Not revenge fantasies or personal vendettas. Just a father who showed up every day, who chose healing over hatred, who turned his daughter's tragedy into a catalyst for systemic change that would protect countless other children. Simple, unglamorous, real, and in the end, more powerful than any revenge could ever be. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.